Victory comes only after many struggles and countless defeats. But why do people resist? They resist when they feel that their rights are being taken away. That means all great resistant movements started against some form of exploitation. Namaste and welcome to second day of Disha Bharat's My Bharat campaign. I, Sushma Gubbi, on behalf of Disha Bharat, take this immense pleasure to welcome one and all on a journey of Bharat's great history, culture, and tradition. Before we delve deep into the topic, let's understand why Disha Bharat as a platform takes every opportunity that comes its way to talk about Bharat with pride. We conduct personality development programs for college students through activity based workshops. In the last 16 years, we have come to understand that the youth of our country face lot of challenges due to Western influence and misinterpretation of history in our own books. With this regard, one of our most popular sessions for college students is Namaste India quiz, through which we try to imbue the spirit of patriotism. When students understand the real history of Bharat, we see them beaming with pride. Thus, understanding the history of Indian victories and resistance to invasion is critical in instilling confidence in today's youth and, in turn, development of Bharat. With this regard, we have an eminent speaker with us today, Shri Sandeep Balakrishna. We welcome you, sir. I request Shri Vinay KL, a Disha volunteer, to introduce the guest speaker. Shri KL Vinay ji is a retired general manager RBI NABARD. He volunteers with various social service organizations and has conducted several blood donation camps. Sir, the stage is yours. Please introduce our guest for today, sir.
Uh, Thank you, Sushma. Namaste and good evening to all our friends for joining us. During the 15 days, right from yesterday onward, that is 1st August, listening to our speakers, we will not only be discovering some aspects of Bharat, but also discovering ourselves. So let us be together for this beautiful journey for the next 15 days. Who will be speaking on a very important topic, that is history of victory, Bharat resistance and triumph against invasions. Sir, we welcome you once again on behalf of the Disha Bharat family and all the viewers. Sri Balakrishna sir is an independent scholar, columnist, public intellectual, and a noted analyst on historical aspects. He comes with a rich corporate experience in companies like Honeywell, Symphony Services, Cisco, and Niti Digital. He is also the founder and chief editor of the Dharma Dispatch, which started in 2018. This is a Sri Sandeep Balakrishna sir has authored many books, which includes number one, Tipu Sultan, the Tyrant of Mysore. Second, 70 years of secularism, unpopular essays on the unofficial political region of India. Third, Invaders and Infidels, Book 1, From Sindh to Delhi, the 500-year journey of Islamic invasions. Then, the Madurai Sultanate, a concise history. He has also translated a very famous Kannada author's book, Sri S.L. Bhairappa's Avarana, from Kannada into English, which is currently in its 9th reprint. Over to you, Sandeep Balakrishna sir. The stage is yours.
Namaste, Sushma ji. Namaste, Shri Vinay ji. Thank you for the generous introduction. So before we begin, I would also like to, extend my very, very warm welcome to everyone who's joined this live program. It's quite an interesting and I should say quite a timely topic that Disha Bharat has chosen, and they've been doing some fantastic work. Anyway, with that background, let's quickly look at the title of today's discussion, which is the history of victory, Bharat's resistance and triumph against invasions. So before we actually begin to get into the examine the topic in a fair bit of detail, let's look at a few key themes that surround this topic today, and try to understand why this topic is so important, and why it is so highly appropriate, not just in today's context, but even for the future, and for the past, in a manner of speaking. So as most of you here who've joined this session already know, but I think it's good to repeat it. India, or Bharatavarsha, is the last surviving non-Abrahamic civilization. We must remember that India is not just a nation state, that just propped up sometime in 1947 or after 1858 or something. We must remember that Bharatavarsha, I use this word very carefully, Bharatavarsha is the last surviving non-Abrahamic civilization, and it is the only spiritual civilization in the entire history of mankind. And let me go a step further and say that if we lose this civilization, we might retain India as a country, but if we lose this civilization that animates, that underlies this geographical landmass, if we lose that, who knows, we will turn into one of the 51 exclusive Islamic countries in the world, which are constantly on the boil, which can erupt into civil wars at any time, if that is on the one side. Or we might become like, say, the United States, arguably the most powerful country in the world. We might become like the United States, which is not a civilization. The United States, I repeat, is not a civilization, but it is a rootless materialism which only has a large geography. Now, let's take the example of, or rather, I took the example of the US deliberately in order to kind of, set the context for today's discussion in a much clearer fashion. So in the 1920s, the famous British novelist and writer Oscar Wilde, most of you might have read him. In the 1920s, Oscar Wilde said, and I quote, "America is the only country in the world which went from barbarism to decadence without passing through civilization." I'll repeat that. America is the only country in the world which went from barbarism to decadence without passing through civilization. Close quote. Now look, let's look at this, to continue this example some more. Now the US is the only country in the world which is highly insecure about its history. I mean, you have Europe, which can, boast of its medieval history and all its scientific inventions and Renaissance and Reformation and Industrial Revolution. It has a fair bit of history, which is true. Europe can boast of all that, but the US doesn't have any such history, and which is why it is highly insecure about its past. And for it, according to it, this history of the United States begins only in 1776. Okay, that is about 300 years prior to now. So according to the US, their history begins only in 1776, and the entire world accepts this version of its history largely without questioning its truth, although some efforts have been made to kind of, unearth the real truth. But largely speaking, it says that American history begins with the Declaration of Independence in 1776, but be that as it may, this narrative is set in motion simply because there is hardly any trace of the US history prior to 1776. You see what I'm getting at? There is no physical trace, or there is very, very minimal fractional physical traces today of the pre-1776 history of the United States. All its pagans, or Red Indians as they were called, they were brutally, condemned to genocide. They brought in smallpox. They were killed, tortured on a massive scale, and no truth has come out of their graves. So we have to examine today's, or rather contextualize, today's topic in this light, so that we can get a fuller understanding of the importance of today's topic of the historical victories of India and our resistance. Because unlike the Red Indians in the US, unlike the Aborigines in Australia or New Zealand, unlike the native people of South America or Africa, Hindus who underwent same genocides or similar genocides, multiple genocides spread over an extraordinarily long period, Hindus who underwent the same tragic fate, we have not only lived to tell the tale of that genocides, but we have emerged victorious, or at least partially victorious. So, but to more fully set the context of today's discussion before we proceed, I would like to quote the memorable words of Kulapati K.M. Munshi, and I quote, this is what Munshi ji says: I have seen and felt the form, continuity, and meaning of India's past. History, as I see it, is being consciously lived by Indians. Attempts to complete what has happened in the past form no small part of our modern struggle. To be a history in the true sense of the word, the work must be the story of the people inhabiting a country. It must be a record of their life from age to age, presented through the life and achievements of men whose exploits become the beacon lights of tradition. Men through whose values which the people have accepted or reacted to, and which created or shaped their collective will. Through the efforts of the people to will themselves into an organic unity. The role of alien invasions in the history of India, hitherto exaggerated, deserves to be reduced to its appropriate proportions. But during all this period, the vitality of the race and culture, it expressed itself with unabated rigor. The history of India is not the story of how she underwent foreign invasions, but how she resisted them and eventually triumphed over them. Close quote. So I think nobody can, set the context for today's discussion better than this great man, K.M. Munshi. And, every time I read these words and I keep, revisiting this passage, I mean, the sheer majesty, the sheer inspiration that, it gives you, it is something else. It can't be described in mere words. And once again, I express my heartfelt thanks to Disha Bharat for choosing such an appropriate topic for today's discussion, and not only just today's discussion, but for this lecture series that they've organized throughout this month. So with this background, and even as we speak, this history of the Hindu resistance and triumph is not in the past tense. We must not use it in the past tense, but we must use it in the present tense. Because like I said, as a civilization, we are constantly battling against various global forces. It could be Islamism, it could be Christian evangelism, conversions. It could be the kind of, crass materialism imported from the West. I think Sushma ji spoke about, the horrible influences of Western culture. These are some of the forces that we are battling. And of course, the far left ideology, you can call it wokeism, whatever you want to call it. So all these forces have combined for the first time in history. All these forces have combined and they have chosen India or Bharatavarsha as their battleground. As a battleground for what? For what? And what the answer to this question will form some of the part of the lecture today. And they have combined here for this battleground so that we should be aware of what they're doing every minute, every second, so that, we can save, we can preserve the greatest ever civilization and culture that the human spiritual genius has ever created. And I have no hesitation in repeating on any platform that if Sanatana civilization, if Sanatana values are not preserved in India, they will not be preserved anywhere else in the world. Take it from me, as simple as that. But then let's think about, some of these dangerous forces that, I just mentioned. These same forces were also at work throughout history, dating back to say about 1000 years, that is an entire millennium. Except that in today's context, their tactics, their methods, their technology, their techniques have only their tactics and methods have changed, but their goal remains the same. And that goal is to break India by breaking its core, which again is Sanatana Dharma, which is why it is important to study, teach, and spread the story of how we as Hindus have resisted all these forces throughout these 1000 years of history, and how we emerged victorious, or at least partially victorious, because we lost about, say, 25% of our sacred geography just 75 years ago. That was the partition of India 75 years ago, was the first great victory of these alien forces which are inherently hostile to Hindu civilization. But then the story of Hindu resistance, its multiple spurts of periodic renewal and recovery. This entire history is just one story, but it is made up of different chapters which is spread over different periods of time and places across the sacred geography. But it is the details buried in these chapters that really open up our eyes and gives us a profound guidance on how we should shape our response and policy, both for the present and for the future. So for this lecture, I have divided this inspiring and even tragic story of resistance and eventual triumph into 12 broad sections, which we can, briefly look at one by one. So number one, the first stage, most of you are aware of this. The first stage, it begins in the early 8th century with the invasion of, Muhammad bin Qasim. That is the infamous Arab invasion of Sindh, as you all know. And what is important is that his role, like Munshi ji said, it has been very exaggerated in our history book so far. What has happened, what is important in our context is that Muhammad bin Qasim, he stayed about just 3 years in India, and not even India, but in some parts of Sindh. Okay, what is today in Pakistan and some parts of Afghanistan. So what happened to India in the aftermath, after Qasim left India? What happened after that? Almost immediately, Qasim did not establish a firm foothold at all in India. He could establish only one great foothold in Multan, that is Mulastana, for example. That's all. Beyond that, as soon as he left, all the regions that he had conquered, the Hindu kings and chiefs out there, they kept reverting back to Hinduism. They rebuilt their temples, they reconverted, and they kept on giving a fight. So from Muhammad bin Qasim up to Mahmud Ghazni, which is about 250 years, Arab Muslims could not get any kind of foothold anywhere, even in the borders of India. That is a kind of pushback that Hindus as a collective gave. And after Qasim, before we just come to Mahmud of Ghazni, we have this amazing, extraordinary hero, Maharaja Jayapala Deva. I call him the last frontier Hindu hero. I mean, amazing. You have to just bow your head in reverence to this man. When he saw, he realized what Mahmud was doing, actually, that, it was not just one kind of a mere invasion, but a brutal kind of all-out war that included, Islamizing Hindus, entirely changing their ways of life and their traditions. So he preempted Mahmud of Ghazni, and on his own initiative, he attacked Ghazni itself. Ghazni is in Afghanistan, as you all know. He attacked Ghazni himself and tried to finish off Mahmud in his own home. And, unfortunately, due to various reasons, that could not happen. But this man, this amazing hero, after he lost in a very decisive battle against Mahmud. He had to, agree to a very, very humiliating surrender to Mahmud and, accept his subordination. He went back to his capital and in full public view, he gave a beautiful speech, a very touching, a very moving speech to all his citizens. He said, look, as a Kshatriya, as your protector, as your king, I have failed in my duty to protect you. And I no longer deserve to sit in this throne. So what he did is in full public view, he took off all his royal clothes, his crown and, all his royal clothes. He put on simple clothes and then he went to a pyre of wood, that was already prepared. He lay down there and instructed his own son to set fire to it. Where will you find such, heroes today? The same goes with his son who succeeded him. His name is Anandapala. Anandapala also, fought multiple battles, at least 3 major battles against Mahmud of Ghazni. And, in a last, in the final decisive battle, it is called a Battle of Chach. It occurred in 1008, that is 1008. That was his last, defensive battle against Mahmud. And that is historic for extraordinary reasons. Okay, like his father, Anandapala, he got news that, this bugger Mahmud is going to, attack me again. So what he did as a preemptive measure was that when he heard this news, he sent his ambassadors throughout India, and all the Hindu kings, they responded positively. I think this is the first and the earliest time where all Hindu kings, okay, they united for the first time and they set aside their, whatever differences and hostilities, and they sent their armies to assist Anandapala, and they declared their objective. And I read it out from, a historical work. This Hindu unity of the princes of Hindustan now hinged on a resolute objective. It was their dharma, their sacred duty to expel these unclean Mlechas from Bharatavarsha forever. Forces from regions as diverse as Kalinjara, that is Bundelkhand today, Kalinjara, Ujjaini, Gwalior, Kannauj, Ajmer and Delhi all marched to assist Anandapala. The Hindu females on this occasion sold their jewels and sent the sale proceeds from distant parts of Hindustan to their husbands, so that they, being supplied with all the necessities, might be helped in fighting the war against the Mlecha. Those people who were poor, those Hindus who were poor, contributed from their earnings by spinning cotton and other labor. End quote. Anandapala also lost, but after that we know the, I don't need to repeat, Mahmud of Ghazni's, trail of destruction, how he, ravaged the entire North India, and, for the first time, he destroyed the great temple of Somanatha. You all know this history. So, I don't think I need to elaborate on that. But what happened after Ghazni went back, after Mahmud went back to Ghazni from Somanatha? Now, it is interesting that what happened after Somanatha was destroyed by Ghazni, by Mahmud. Okay, a huge confederacy of Hindu kings led by Paramara Bhoja. Okay, they were waiting to take revenge, and Mahmud heard this and he was so scared. Okay, how do our books, describe Mahmud of Ghazni? They describe him as a great warrior, fighter and all that. Sure, he was all that, but this side is also there. When Raja Bhojaraja and other people, they, combined together to, take revenge and, kill Mahmud, he heard the news and like a coward, he took different routes. He avoided all the main roads and, passed through the Thar desert, and, with great risk to his own life, he had to go back to Ghazni. Okay, this story nobody tells. But what happened again after, Mahmud, went back to Ghazni, in just 5 years, Somanatha rebounded. It flourished with greater splendor. Okay, and this, we must note that this is a pattern that kept on repeating throughout our history, which means the moment the Islamic invader left, Hindus would regroup and they would re-emerge with greater vigor and splendor. This happened, and this could happen because of their faith in the unshakable Sanatana spirit. This was a real power, that kept building and rebuilding and rejuvenating throughout these 1,000 years. Now, after Ghazni, we have, Mahmud of Ghori. That story also, I don't think we need to spend much time on that. But the unfortunate part is that for the first time, after the Second Battle of Tarain in 1192, there was not a single large Hindu empire throughout North India. Not a single large Hindu empire that could combat, an alien Muslim invader ever since. So this is a big, great tragedy. So from this guy, what's his name? Muhammad of Ghori. After that, we come to the next great, or rather the next, barbaric invader, who is, as you all know, Alauddin Khalji. And for the first time, it was Khalji who, crossed the Vindhya Parvata, and he went all the way, he along with, his slave, Malik Kafur. They crossed the Vindhya mountains and went all the way till Rameshwaram. And they gave, for the first time, they gave a full taste of what a brutal Islamic invasion looks like in practice, in practical experience. For the first time, the Hindus in South India, they got a taste of what, this means. And after Khalji, the kind of destruction that and chaos that Khalji caused in South India, it was utter, utter confusion across the board. From the Vindhyas, that is Yadavas of Devagiri, all the way up to the Pandyas in Tamil Nadu. The entire South India was in disarray, and Hindus here, they took some time to, kind of even realize what had hit them. And even almost immediately after Alauddin's death, Muhammad bin Tughlaq, he came and with a repeated destruction, almost on the same scale, with the same amount of barbarism, large-scale conversions, all this slave taking, the rest of the horrible things that happen, even that invariably happen with every Islamic invasion. But what happened after Tughlaq's destruction of South India is what is important. That is a chapter, that is written in, that should be written, which is actually written in any case, in letters of gold in the entire history of India from 5,000, 7,000 years. That was the vow, that was the sankalpa, the pramana which was taken by all Hindus in South India, that we will not allow one more Turushka or Mlecha or Turuka to even look in the direction of South India. And what that Sankalpa translated into was the foundation of the grand Vijayanagara Empire. All of us know this history. And one of the first things that happened after the founding of Vijayanagara Empire, in fact, this event was what sealed the power and prestige of Vijayanagara Empire. It was the destruction of something called the Madurai Sultanate, which was established, as the name says, in Madurai today. All the Turushkas in that region, they were completely driven out. And this brilliant story is, narrated by an eyewitness. She is none other than Ganga Devi, the wife of Kampanaraya or Kampa Bhupala. It is the brilliant work, poet, Sanskrit poem called Madhura Vijayam. All of you must read that book. I can't recommend it enough. So, the entire South India for the next 250 odd years, nearly 250 years, was completely free from Islamic invasions of any kind, 250 years. Okay, so then after that, we see the next great stage of Hindu resistance and revival in the story of the great Hemachandra Vikramaditya. Unfortunately, our eminent history textbooks simply calls him as Hemu. What does Hemu mean? What does it even mean? It can mean anybody. I mean, it can mean a Hindu, it can mean a Muslim, it can mean a Christian, it can mean a plant, flower, tree, garden, mountain, hill. It can mean anything. So this is a kind of history that is being fed to us for the last, 4 generations at least. So Hemachandra Vikramaditya, his great distinction is the fact that he was the first Hindu king to sit or to reoccupy the throne of Delhi after nearly 300 years. He came from a very humble origin. He began his life as a fruit and vegetable seller in Delhi. And then he progressed, he rose in the ranks to become a commander. He was an undefeated warrior, and finally he became Vikramaditya. Okay, a grand monarch for the first time after nearly 300 years of uninterrupted Muslim rule in Delhi. Why doesn't any history book talk about him? But for the freak accident, he got wounded in the eye by some arrow during the battle with Akbar, and he died. But for that, I don't think we would have had the Mughal rule for so long. So this is the next stage, and stage number 7 is the well-known story of Maharana Pratap. I think all of everyone in this audience, I don't think I need to tell the details of this amazing Samrat, this great Hindu hero Maharana Pratap. When the rest of his clan, rest of other Rajput kings, they agreed to submit to Akbar just so that they could still remain kings and retain their territory. It was only Maharana Pratap who refused to bow down to this Turushka ruler Akbar, and he stood alone. He fought alone with great difficulty. He used to go without food in the forest, but he never let down the Hindu honor, or he didn't let down his ancestor. I mean, there are legendary stories, I'm sure, about Maharana Pratap. I'm sure most of you are aware of those stories, but one thing, one story really has still stayed in my mind. It is about a poet and a singer who was honored by Rana Pratap. So the Maharana, as part of, he gave him some money and some gifts and presentation. And then he also gave him a pagadi, which is a headgear, to this poet and king. And, after Rana Pratap was deposed and, he had to go into hiding and carry on his fight against Akbar from hiding. This poor singer, he was touring about Rajasthan and various parts of North India. And he arrived, in the court of one ruler, and that ruler was pleased with this guy singing, and he said he also gave him some gift and presentation. But what this singer did was that before he accepted that presentation, he took off the pagadi on his head and then bowed down to this king and accepted the presentation. So the king asked him, why did you take off your pagadi before accepting it? So he proudly said, this pagadi was gifted to me by the great Maharana, and the head that has bowed with this pagadi, it should not bow down before any other ruler, no matter how great he is. So this is the great legacy of Maharana Pratap. And we can come to the 8th section in our discussion today. So throughout the Mughal rule, I mean, which is highly exaggerated in my opinion, we have to read the primary sources to get the full picture of, the so-called glory and greatness of Mughal rule, to understand its harsh reality. But even throughout the Mughal rule, which lasted, for less than 200 years. If you take Akbar as a starting point and Aurangzeb as the end point, it is less than 200 years. But anyway, so throughout the Mughal rule, Hindus never gave up fighting back in different ways because they were completely oppressed, and obviously because individual Hindu kingdoms could never unite together on any matter to throw them out, to throw out the Mughals. Hindus, self-respecting Hindus, kept fighting in their own ways. Now, a little known detail of this history of Hindu resistance during Mughal rule was the fact that how Mughal kings were dependent on Hindu businessmen to maintain the economy of their kingdom, to shape their financial policy, their trade policy, to maintain their accounts. It was Hindu businessmen. All this work was in the hands of Hindu businessmen, and how these Hindu businessmen cleverly and silently used this economic dominance, their sheer economic dominance. These Hindu businessmen used it to their own advantage. They patronized our saints. They gave enormous gifts to different Tirtha Kshetras. They rebuilt many temples, which were beyond the reach of Mughal kings. They sponsored many satsangs. The list is nearly endless. This is a very profound method of showing resistance, and these Hindu businessmen did that, from their kaya, vacha, manasa, from their heart and soul. And the Muslim clergy, okay, which is the ulema, okay, the Muslim ulema, they saw that. They saw what these Hindu businessmen were doing, by with their economic and financial skills, and they continuously kept whining on and on. They kept complaining to the sultans that, look, you might be a great sultan, you might be the undisputed emperor of this land and everything, you might have oppressed the infidels, but these infidel Hindus, you are basically idiots. But because these infidel Hindu businessmen, baniyas, I can't use some of the words that these Muslim historians have used. So, but these vile baniyas, behind your back, that is behind the back of the Sultan, they are reviving this haram, infidel, kafir religion. But you guys, you are spending all your time and money on, drinking wine and women and, taking opium and hashish. So this is what the Muslim clergy kept complaining to the Sultan. So this is another little known fact of the history of Hindu resistance. And now we can come to the, the ninth section of our discussion today, which is obviously the ascendancy of another great Hindu hero, which is Chhatrapati Shivaji, followed by, the great Maratha Empire. Obviously, I don't think I need to elaborate on Shivaji Maharaj's role or the role of Marathas in reclaiming, India for Hindus, in reclaiming Sanatana Dharma on the soil of its birth. Their role, it has to be worshipped even today. It has to be narrated as stories and poems and songs, to every generation. And you see what happens with, from, just a second. You see, from the time of, could be either Hemachandra Vikramaditya or the Vijayanagar Empire, you see this recurring theme that all it took throughout these ages, all it took was just one powerful Hindu leader behind whom the entire Hindu society would unite. This is from our past lived experience. And, when the Marathi, by the time Shivaji came and with the death of Aurangzeb, Islam was politically, extinguished. After that, it never could, rise its head either in the form of military or, politically in any manner, except for that Tipu Sultan fellow, but that was very brief. So throughout, when we survey this nearly 1,000-year history, what we also see is that Islam, it met its worst ever defeat in India. When it started, with Muhammad in Arabia, when it started in a span of just 36 to 40 years, it swept the entire Arabian Peninsula. This side, it destroyed ancient Persia and, parts of Afghanistan, and that side, it knocked on the doors of Spain also. So this was the power of Islam, throughout the Middle Ages. But in India, it could never get a firm foothold, which is why, and all those countries, all those ancient civilizations were completely wiped out. Not so in India. Okay, this is another, it is a well-known fact, but it has to be remembered at all times just to understand the magnitude of our resistance and eventual victory. So after the Marathas, we come to the, obviously the British period. Even here, when the British, especially the East India Company under Robert Clive and his successors, when the larger Hindu society saw what the kind of atrocities these the British were doing, we had something called the Sannyasi Andolan, about which I have done a 3-part series. In fact, there's a beautiful book published by Rashtrottana Parishad by the same name, Sannyasi Andolana. It is a must-read book. So a bunch of sannyasis throughout, especially in the region of Bengal, which was where the atrocities of East India Company were the maximum in the initial days. So, the kind of resistance that they gave, the kind of territories that they wrested back from, they pulled back from the British, the amount of blood they shed and the sacrifices and, the enormous pain that these sannyasis, there are a bunch of people who had given up everything just to save this motherland and its culture. The resistance that, they put up is, it brings tears to the eyes, and, everyone must read that glorious chapter of resistance. And then we come to the next section, which is the 11th section, which deals with the freedom struggle as we know it in the popular imagination. But inherently, what was the Indian freedom struggle? It was really a struggle for recovering the best of Sanatana civilization and culture. As simple as that. What were the motives of the Indian freedom struggle? What were the icons? What were the inspirations? It was all of that was drawn from Hindu lore. It was drawn from our Puranas. It was drawn from Mahabharata, Ramayana, Vishnu Purana, our ancient sadhus, sannyasis, our heroes. The symbolism, poetry, painting, everything that, emerged during the freedom struggle. See, Indian freedom struggle has many different aspects to it, and the political aspect and, agitations and physical fight, revolution is just one part of it. During the entire period of the freedom struggle, that is, roughly 90 years, if you take 1858 as a cutoff point and 1947, this was a very fertile period which witnessed a great renaissance, which is something I'll just come to in the last section. So what were the inspirations from? Where did our heroes of our freedom struggle derive their inspiration? From Sanatana civilization and culture, from its traditions, from its lifestyles, from the path laid down by our illustrious ancestors. And, the best way to understand this is to compare what actually happened at partition. This is a great contrast. What actually happened at partition, when we examine that, that will give us the real clue about the actual Muslim contribution to the freedom struggle. This punctures that other great hot air balloon, that keeps saying that, Hindu, Muslim, bye-bye, they both contributed for India's freedom. In which case, why did they demand Pakistan? So when anybody says, talks about freedom struggle, let us be under no illusion or confusion that it was led, inspired, and finally brought about by the Hindu Sanatana community, Sanatana Samaj, and the larger cultural inheritance that actually gave us the freedom. This is what, R.C. Majumdar says in his introduction to the history and culture of the Indian people. He says that, it is a common mistake. I'm paraphrasing him, not the exact words. He says that, in the popular perception, it is assumed that India attained, independence only in 1947 from the British. On the contrary, a truthful understanding of Indian history shows that in 1857, India only changed masters. She was not free for 500 years before 1857. This is what R.C. Majumdar says. Anyway, so now we come to the 12th and the final, section of our discussion today. Which is very, very interesting, which is very crucial actually, and it has often been ignored for obvious reasons all these years. This is what we can call as the modern Indian Renaissance. Now, what happened when when British colonization was complete, say after the First War of Indian Independence, 1857, what happened then? What happened during that time was that one generation had already, come up, had already grown, which was educated in English, which knew British culture by visiting Britain itself, and which was also culturally rooted. They were essentially devout Orthodox Hindus who also knew English. Some of them, like Sri Aurobindo, they studied in England and they came back here. That story is well known. This was a new generation, which, at one time when British colonization was at its peak, this class of Indians who also were educated in the British method, who had seen English society, European society, and then who had come back, they realized, rather they were reawakened to the greatness of their own cultural heritage and inheritance. So what they began is that they used the same tools and language and the idiom that the British had given them. They used these tools to give back to the British in the same coin and to uphold the greatness of India and all of India's contributions. So this batch of, luminaries of this modern Indian Renaissance, this went on in an unbroken fashion for nearly 100 years, roughly. From, if you take 1850 as a cutoff point, you can take 1950 or 1955 as, the end point of that. So you take any field, it produced only the greatest minds, the most extraordinarily talented people. Could be in science, metallurgy, chemistry, in history, Dharma Shastras, for example. You have hundreds of examples. Okay, they were trained in both methods, but they realized their culture was actually more profound and that it paid to maintain and preserve this culture. And they also understood the kind of assault that colonial British rule, ongoing colonial British rule, the kind of assault that it was doing on their cultural inheritance. Radha Kumud Mukherjee, R.C. Majumdar, P.V. Kane, host Dr. S. Shrikanta Shastri. I've written a long piece on this one, so you can read that. I can't list out all the names in the space of this. The point is that some of these scholars, if not most of them, they knew multiple languages and they could read primary sources itself. Jadunath Sarkar, for example, amazing man. So if he had to write say, for example, the Mughal history, he's obviously the authority on Aurangzeb and the Mughal history and Mughal administration. Because the records were in Persian or Farsi language, he learned Farsi so that he could study them, know the truth from the primary source, from the first hand. This was the caliber of those people. Anand Kumaraswamy, for example, the kind of pushback that he gave especially to in the field of art criticism done by these so-called Oriental scholars. I mean, amazing guy. So this is a story of modern Indian Renaissance. If a serious study is done on all aspects of this, it can easily take up not less than say 10 or 12 volumes of say about 1,500 pages. This is a work of generations. Unfortunately, not even one book has come out so far. But anyway, so with that, this 12 sections of this history of resistance and triumph can be concluded at this point. And I'll, just to add some concluding notes. So this entire period, that is from the minor raid of Muhammad bin Qasim, from that period right up to 1947, this entire period of 1 millennium should be collectively called the age of resistance. Okay, but unfortunately, our history, the way it has been written so far, it splits this age of resistance into various parts, like, the Muslim period, the British period, and so far, which only shows that we are viewing history from the tools that they have given, from their eyes. We were continuously resisting, both the Islamic invaders and occupiers, as well as the British occupiers. So if that is not resistance, what else is it? So, like I've written repeatedly, the way in which we look at our own history, it determines the true lessons that we will be able to learn from it. But what is also notable in, in this entire story is that, and, this is largely overlooked, is the fact that only the political history of India has been subjected to all kinds of distortions, falsehoods, politics, all that, eminent historians, Romila Thapar type. Only the political history has been subjected to this kind of mischief. But the philosophical and the spiritual history of India has been preserved intact with zero distortions. So what does that tell you? What does that tell you about how we not only view the history, but how the real history and where this real history of India has been preserved? So this, these philosophical and spiritual history of India, for example, even the cultural history of India, sculptures, inscriptions, there are spurious inscriptions, but that we are talking about only genuine inscriptions, coins, they tell you a different story. Literature. You see, one of the finest methods to understand the history, the real history of India, is to study its literature. In any language, Sanskrit, Kannada, Hindi, Tamil, Telugu, Malayalam, Gujarati, Marathi, Bengali, whatever, any language. Read the classical history, literature of India from the ancient times. From Ramayana, Mahabharata up to even 20th century. I mean, pre-independence literature, classical literature. A totally different history emerges from that. Anyway, so, but if we are truthful to ourselves, we will understand that what happened in 1947, it was just a pause, it was a temporary victory, because real freedom is the freedom to own our own cultural heritage. We have to take ownership of our cultural heritage, which is when we will we will understand the real meaning and enjoy real freedom or independence. And this work should have happened after 1947, but instead, you all know what happened after 1947. We got a completely homegrown political dynasty which oppressed its own people in a far more crude manner than the British could have ever done. So that began one more round of freedom struggle of, the most profound, perhaps, a very stark kind of a freedom struggle began after that, after 1947, but that is a story for another day. I don't think, I think most of us know that story. It's fairly contemporary. So finally, at least to my mind, India as a spiritual civilization, as the last bastion of a great unbroken cultural tradition, this India is still not, we as inheritors of this great spiritual civilization, we are fully not free. Although great efforts have been made and they are ongoing, many great efforts like this one, the Disha lecture series is one such effort. Although many such efforts are ongoing on a continuous basis, we still have a long way to go, in being completely free in the most profound and the truest sense of that word. And as I've spoken and written on numerous occasions, real freedom begins with a recognition that we need to first psychologically decolonize ourselves. Remember that we were subjected, this generation, especially post-independent generation, has been subjected to a torture of a triple colonization. The first is obviously the Islamic colonization. The second is the Macaulayite or whatever, British colonization. The third is the most dangerous. It is a colonization of the worst kind of the brown man. It is Nehruvian colonization, which is very, very difficult to, escape from, to kind of extract ourselves from. So we need to escape, decolonize from this triple colonization. Psychologically, we have to do that. And to do that, for example, we should ask ourselves some fundamental questions like, how did we as Hindus define ourselves as individuals? What was our relationship to the earth, to the nature, to the world, to all of creation, to water, rivers, mountains, hills, trees, animals, fishes, whales, ponds, lakes? How did we define our relationship to that? How did we live with them? What was our attitude to that? And how did we regard money? Was it simply a commodity? Was it a value? Was it something more profound than that? What was our value of, say, family? How did we regard a wife, children, infants, our immediate community, neighborhood, our village, our cities? And last but not the least, what was the original genius behind creating such grand and enduring cultural and other physical institutions? It could be charitable institutions, rest houses, hospitals, public utilities. What was the original genius that created all these enduring institutions, some of which, are still in existence and they're still thriving? For example, what explains the amazing longevity and unbrokenness of our mathas? For example, that is a great example living in front of our eyes. Some of the mathas are more than 1,500 years old and they're still new. What explains their longevity? Is it just people and bunch of instructions and administrative manuals that that have kept them alive so far? What is it? What explains all those rest houses in the Ghats of Varanasi and other places? So you see, I can multiply such examples, but in a manner of speaking, we can truthfully ask these questions to ourselves and be ready to accept even disturbing answers. Only when we do that, we can take up such most basic elements of our daily life. See, this unbroken facets of Sanatana culture and civilization, it is still in operation at a very, very fundamental and subtle level. Just because we can't see it, around us in a physical form doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It's the proverbial thing of, polishing the diamond from buried underneath, rubble or something. It is that polishing is required. For that, truth is the best, the best weapon, the best method, and the best way to do that. And once we do that, once we re-examine in the light of our own lived historical experiences, recall the stories of our grandmothers, grandfathers, whatever it is, their lifestyles, what values they lived by, and then you collate it with the, written history, then, we have taken perhaps a great leap towards achieving the freedom, the real freedom that I was talking about so far. And yeah, I think we can conclude with that. Thank you once again to everyone out here at Disha Bharat, for the entire audience for being for giving me a patient hearing, and thanks once more. I'm glad I'll be willing to take any questions that you might have.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. Thank you for the 12 chapters you choose to talk today, and you reassured that as Bharatiyas, we were tolerant and we are tolerant, but when time arrives, we know how to resist and regroup ourselves even after the barbaric defeats. It was wonderful insight you gave us today. So if we revisit our invasions, we can understand that the DNAs of our ancestors were profound, and today's youth must know the true history. I once again thank you. I think we have one question we can take today, or one or two, because it's already a little late. So, do you have time, sir? 2-3 minutes? We can extend?
Yeah, we can take a couple of questions, no problem.
Okay, sir. So there's one question from the Facebook reader who was sent. Please throw some light on Aryan invasion theory.
Well, I don't think that is directly related to today's topic, but that is a subject which is, still without any definitive conclusion. But one thing is, for sure, that it is a myth. It never occurred. No Aryans came from outside on some chariots or horses and then invaded India, and rest of the falsehoods that have been propagated. That is a myth.
Okay. So the last question, sir, because it's okay. So when you say, I agree that Americans are highly insecure about the history, but even today, youth prefer US or many other countries over India when it comes to higher education and, of course, for materialism. So with this regard, please give a message to our youth that India is a far better place than all these materialism which we run behind. So the message for youth, sir, today.
Yeah, well, this fascination of Hindus, especially, for running away to America, this largely happened due to the misrule of the Congress party. Okay, remember the promises that our leaders made, and some of these leaders were honest. When we got freedom, that we will rebuild the nation, we will make it prosperous again, we will bring back, the best of our culture and civilization. But unfortunately, the entire political structure was rigged in such a system by one family, one dynasty, and I address him always as Nawab Nehru. So when you have a Nawab ruling, occupying the highest office for 17 long years, this is what happens. And who is fascinated with communism and the kind of leaders that he will produce, who will succeed him, he'll surround himself with such people who are more incompetent than him.
Okay.
So an impoverished middle class was created.
Okay.
We were at middle class. That middle class kept shrinking. So when you institutionalize things like reservations, this is not a popular opinion. I'm not a film star to seek popularity. Okay, I'm more concerned about the civilization and nation and everything that hinders its further growth, its genuine growth, and realizing its potential. Why shouldn't I speak about it? So all kinds of misplaced policies which hindered merit. No self-respecting person will stay at a place where his talent, his honesty, his hard work, his effort is not respected. So this was one of the primary reasons for this wave of migration to the US. And of course, then we have this colonized Hindu mind, which also contributed, which said that everything West is good, everything India is backward, and that mix of both, but primarily economic opportunities is what caused this, exodus to US. But I don't think too many people nowadays, at least in the last 10-15 years, I don't think, okay, they might like the US and its lifestyle and the wide roads and cleanliness and everything there. But I don't think they have that kind of addiction towards India that at least my generation had.
Thank you, sir. We really appreciate the time you've given us today. We thank you for answering all the questions which readers have asked. We hope our youth will revisit the history in the right sense and acknowledge the victories and resistance you spoke about today. Unless we understand our Sanatan Dharma, our future doesn't look promising, because we think our ancestors were weak and incompetent. But as we all know, it is not true. So thank you once again. It was great pleasure having you on our platform. We wish to see you, hear you more in the future days. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's my pleasure, my honor.
Thank you. Yeah. We thank all the audience and guest speaker for gracing the occasion today. Continuing with the 15 days lecture series on My Bharat, tomorrow we have with us Kajampadi Subramanya Bhatt, who is going to talk about Prachina Bharatada Hirime Garimegalu. ನಾಳೆ ನಮ್ಮೊಂದಿಗೆ ಕಾಜಂಪಾಡಿ ಸುಬ್ರಹ್ಮಣ್ಯ ಭಟ್ ಇರ್ತಾರೆ. ಅವರು ಪ್ರಾಚೀನ ಭಾರತದ ಹಿರಿಮೆ ಗರಿಮೆಗಳ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಮಾತಾಡ್ತಾರೆ. So we hope to see more Facebook audience tomorrow to revisit our ancient Bharat. Stay tuned to Disha Bharat Facebook page to hear more about Bharat and Bharatiyata. Namaskar.